Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our latest webinar. I'm Dr. Mansoor, an analytical community coordinator in PSDI, and I'll be facilitating today's webinar. Let me introduce our speaker. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Samantha P.M. Kanza, today's speaker. And Samantha is the Principal Senior Enterprise Fellow at PSDI, University of Southampton. She is also the Principal Investigator for the Careers and Skills for Data-Driven Research, CASTR, and serves as a Pathfinder lead for process recording under the PSDI framework. As part of her works, she has explored the challenges of making research data truly fair, that is, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. One approach is moving from paper lab notebooks to electronic lab notebooks or ELNs. Sounds simple, but as Samantha has discovered over the past decade, it's a journey full of technical hurdles, people challenges, and realization that digital doesn't automatically means fair. So in today's taking us through that twisty, turny adventure full of challenges, creative solutions, and lessons learned along the way. And while the title says Ballad, she promised she is not singing, and unless, of course, if the story demands it. Samantha, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mansoor, and thanks to PSDI for once again letting me come back and share my slightly ridiculous stories. So today we're going to delve into my decade-long journey well, actually possibly slightly more than a decade now, so I'm going to have to reevaluate that math, but a decade-long journey in investigating how to implement electronic lab notebooks. So to start with, I'm going to tell you a bit about me and how I ended up here, and then I'm going to set the scene for why ELNs are so important. And then we're going to delve into the twisty, turny ELN journey, which I didn't just call it that because it rhymes. It has actually been quite a sort of up and down situation. And I'm going to talk about all of the different ELN projects I've worked on, which have taught me so much about all of the challenges and potential mitigations. And then I'm going to talk about sort of the considerations I think are really, really important for implementation. And then I'm going to finish up by detailing the relevant PSDI resources that have been created to aid with this process. So as reminded by Sharkat and Mansoor, despite the title of this webinar, I really promise that I will not sing. Trust me, you don't want to hear it. Although if anyone is wondering which fandom the title came from, because that is something I tend to do with all of my presentations, I will be revealing it at the end. And for the eagle-eyed among you, there will be some clues throughout the presentation. So first about me. So thanks for the introduction, Mansoor. I am a Principal Enterprise Fellow at the University of Southampton. And I wear many hats for my job, which is mainly an excuse for me to put a witch's hat on me at this point, but obviously PI for CASDAR, the Careers and Skills for Data-Driven Research Network, and also Pathfinder Lead on Process Recording for PSDI, which is the role I'm presenting in today. So I must confess, despite my role in PSDI, and despite working in the chemistry department for close to 8 years and having done my PhD there, I'm not actually a chemist. I did a computer science undergraduate degree. And after a brief stint in industry, where I worked out that the corporate world was not for me, I sprinted full speed back into academia and I did a web science PhD. And web science is really cool because it's this interplay between computer science and sociology, and it looks at the real importance of the human element in technology and technology development, and it views technology such as the web and indeed things like electronic lab notebooks as a social technical concept where the human intervention and how we use the technology and react around the technology is just as much, if not more important than the technology itself. And I kind of wanted to mention this because, I mean, not only was my PhD where I first discovered my love of electron lab notebooks and started really investigating all of this area, but it's also because if I've learned anything in this kind of last decade-long journey, it's that when it comes to implementing new systems, the people are both the biggest challenge, but also kind of ultimately are key to success. And I just really want you to bear that in mind throughout this webinar. So why are we here? Why should you actually care about what I'm going to say, apart from potentially enjoying my pretty pictures? Well, I think it's well understood that reproducibility in science is a big problem. And one of the reasons is because there's still a really big disconnect between what scientists do in the laboratory and during their daily research and what actually gets captured and then what actually gets sort of published through to everybody else. And I will say this is exacerbated by the fact that there is still a very fragmented approach to recording this scientific research. I mean, at least there certainly is in academia, but I have to say I've been to enough industry conferences to know that industry is also not immune to this issue. And ultimately, there are still people writing things up on paper, which is kind of wild when we think about what century we're in. But they're recording other bits digitally, and most things are not really being put in a coherent place that others can find. And most of the time, even if they can find it, then there's not kind of suitable information there, or it's not all in one place to actually build upon it properly. And this means that despite all of the very good work that's going on across our different research institutions, a lot of scientific research cannot be reused or reproduced, which is a big waste when you think about it. So why is this happening? Is it because people are still using paper? Is paper, in fact, the root of all evil? Well, I would argue paper isn't really the villain here. It's really the well-meaning sidekick that doesn't quite realise it's enabling evil. And I say this because paper at its core isn't the key issue. So for years, I've heard the argument that the main reason scientific research isn't reproducible is because things are recorded on paper. But things can actually be recorded well on paper. So I had the great pleasure of presenting for the Royal Society of Chemistry Historical Group last year at a specific event on digital notebooks. Some people sort of presented on the past, a whole range of notebooks were presented on dating back centuries, and I kind of came in and did the sort of more current future bit. But when I was looking at how early scientists recorded their work, the presentation on Darwin's notebook struck me as particularly impressive, because these were, meticulously written, and essentially created his own sort of paper-based index system, so we could locate different bits of information. And I think this is just a key demonstration that actually, just because something was recorded on paper, which at the time was the only option, it doesn't mean it can't be recorded in great detail. And similarly, sort of during my research PhD, I guess I saw some very highly questionable electronic practices, such as people sitting down next to each other and manually transposing spreadsheets rather than just using a collaborative spreadsheet. And I've worked on a whole range of different domain-based projects, from sort of social science to agriculture, as well as chemistry and computer science. And particularly when I was working in this agricultural project, it was my job to take a load of different data sets and collate them together and mark them up semantically. And the data sets that I found were pretty terrible. They were wildly inconsistent, very poorly formatted, and in some cases contained absolutely no useful information whatsoever about what the data was supposed to be. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is good and bad aren't inherently linked to the tools that you use. It's more about how you use them. And there is ultimately a lot more to good note-taking practices than merely implementing an electronic system. However, there are some potentially dire consequences of using paper, or indeed of using electronic systems in a poor fashion. So I want to give a shout out to this cartoon, which was drawn by the brilliant Keris Willoughby, who I think I saw on the participants list. So Keris drew this for the paper we wrote together in 2017, which was ELN's Can They Replace Paper? And this cartoon shows 3 different scenarios of how badly wrong things can go if work is not properly backed up or shared with the relevant people. So firstly, as one of my colleagues actually sagely reminded me the other day, the first person you're likely to share your data with is your future self. And if past you hasn't recorded things properly or put them in a place where you can access them, you're probably going to be pretty mad at past you. Or as in the third picture, you could actually severely hamper things continuing if for whatever reason you weren't around to contribute and nobody else on the project can access your information. Now this second scenario is a particularly macabre favourite of mine, not because I actually like the idea of the lab catching on fire, I'm actually quite scared of fire, but because it mirrors a really real life issue that happened in Southampton, thankfully before I joined, but one of our lab buildings did burn down. And lots of students lost vast quantities of their work and their notes. And I remember when I did my focus group for my PhD, I asked some of the researchers, how do you back up your electronic work? And I was given this really detailed rundown of all the precautions that they'd taken. And when the question turns to how had they backed up their paper notes, the answers were mostly that they didn't. Apart from one person who very proudly informed me that they used one of those lab books that had the carbon copy pages so they could have copies of all of their notes, which was all sounding great until they revealed that said torn out pages were still kept in the same drawer as the lab book. And then they were slightly distressed when I mentioned the whole fire situation and said, well, as a heads up, if your lab caught on fire, those copy pages existing wouldn't help you in the slightest. So we really do need to be mindful of these sorts of things. And, of course, implementing electronic systems doesn't magically fix all these issues, because you still need to use them properly. But in terms of making your records accessible to yourself and to others, being able to access them from lots of different places, ensuring that they're properly backed up and you can actually find things, this is really, really important. So, Sharkcat is completely right. Despite everything I've said, paper's not inherently the only problem, but actually we do have a very strong need for an electronic system. And this does come with a strong caveat that if we are going to use digital tools, then we should be using them properly. They should not be used as an electronic sticking plaster. They should be designed and implemented in a way that actually captures the data in a structured form, and it enables sharing, it enables searching, it has mechanisms built in to drive researchers towards producing fairer data. And, so apologies to anyone who came to my last webinar, because I am going to hammer home a point I made there again. But, FAIR is a great set of principles for data sharing, and everyone's very keen to bestow the virtues of tools that enable FAIR. But ultimately, the principles themselves do mainly focus on how to share data in a reusable fashion, but almost presupposes that what you have is worth sharing, if only you have provided the relevant information. But unfortunately, that's often not the case. So we need to ensure we're thinking about reuse and reproducibility throughout the entire research data lifecycle. And if we use them properly, then tools such as electron lab notebooks could form part of this solution. So now it's time to delve into the twisty-turny ELN journey. Now we've gone through the problems that have led to this, and we've agreed that ELNs could be a good idea. However, implementing ELNs is really hard, and it's a complex task I've spent the last decade researching. So a bit of embarrassment, as I mentioned, I started my academic career in computer science, and I was very used to digitizing things. So, new pieces of work spawned new folders, new documents. Group work immediately led to, oh, let's set up a shared Google Drive, or who's going to make the GitHub repository. So I was somewhat baffled when I found out the scientists were still using paper, because this seemed really archaic to me. And then I heard about the notion of electron lab notebooks, and there's a picture of me on this slide. So 2014, freshly master's graduated Sammy, naively positing that surely ELNs were just the answer. Little did I know how things were going to change over the next decade. And I'm not just talking about how much back pain I have now compared to when I was in my 20s, but a lot of things have changed, but also, as you're going to see, some things haven't really changed at all. But ultimately, through this decade, the big thing changes. I've found more and more complexities going on, but hopefully also found more of the answers. So as part of my PhD, I, as I said, quickly discovered that implementing ELNs was no mean feat. And therefore, I undertook extensive research of many different forms to find out why. So this included doing lots of research on the landscape, so talking to researchers across different scientific disciplines, actually donning some lab specs and masquerading as a scientist in the labs to see what was really going on, with ethical approval and consent, of course. And one of the things I was really shocked to find out about was just how many ELNs there were. So this slide shows some graphs from my PhD thesis. So that's kind of showing the state of the market at the time. So how many ELNs there were, including also how many used to exist, because I'd found quite a lot that were active, and then by this point of publishing my PhD were no longer active. And sort of also just giving you an idea of the distribution across sort of different domains, platforms, license type. So again, even back then, sort of 10 years ago, no, not 10 years ago, I guess 7 years ago, there were lots and lots and lots of different options. And in addition to that, between the kind of surveys, focus groups, observations, and literature, I also identified a lot of barriers. So barriers I started off thinking, oh, surely this ELN is just the solution. There's going to be a couple of key players like, Microsoft, Apple, Google. Someone will pick one, we'll just pop it in the lab and it will all be fine. Well, actually, quite apart from there being so many of them, there were a whole range of different barriers that actually made implementing them very, very complicated. So this kind of ranges from logistical barriers around cost and time, people barriers. There was a big reluctance and a big kind of around ELNs, and people really didn't want to change their working practices. They weren't keen to adopt new technology. So kind of harping back to people being one of the biggest issues. And also just a sort of deep reluctance to share data, and a big concern around sort of trusting, putting data in systems, worrying about not being able to move data between different systems and different machines. and also just generally concerns that the software would be hard to use, reports that the software they had used in the first place was actually, if they had to try it, was quite janky. There was also a litany of hardware concerns. So people were worried about like taking their hardware into the lab because they didn't want to spill things on it or contaminate it. There also just often wasn't space. But then if you think about doing that the other way, if you're not going to take computers into the lab, then obviously the flip of that is to write things on paper and then transpose them to an ELN later, which also people thought would be a lot of extra work. So I kind of came out of my PhD having really sort of enjoyed investigating this, but the attitude felt quite negative, certainly in academia, and it was feeling quite daunting and impossible as a task, if I'm honest. And one of my actual key findings, both in my first sort of research paper and my PhD, was that a lot of researchers, certainly in the academic sphere, weren't ready to give up on paper notebooks. However, let's fast forward to 2020, even if I'm sure most of us would potentially rather forget 2020. But we could have been fated to continue as we were, but COVID had other plans. The global lockdown and concerns about spreading germs and being in close proximity to others raised a kind of whole new world of challenges for researchers. However, there was, for those of us, we might have spied a few opportunities from this. So, anecdotally, I had heard from friends that they were using this opportunity to push for more electronic methods, such as just simple things like, oh, you now need to sign my cost form electronically because actually it's not appropriate for you to come and touch my lab book. And so we wondered sort of, could this be the start of something new? Now that we are actually we were in a place where people couldn't necessarily go into the lab physically, and it wasn't maybe appropriate to be, going at other people's pieces of paper. So then 2020 passed in a blur of mostly Zoom calls not working, although I'm not sure that's entirely changed. But if we fast forward to 2021, when we were vaguely being let out of our houses again, kind of thought, well, maybe once we go back, this kind of upheaval will have brought some changes to these archaic practices. Well, in a nutshell, it did and it didn't. So sorry, Shaka, I completely appreciate that's not a very helpful thing to say. But ultimately, there were lots of things that changed and lots of things that didn't. But PSDI came along and decided to have a look at this and investigate it. So I absolutely adored my PhD, despite my conclusions that maybe people weren't ready to give up on paper. I really, really enjoyed studying it, and ELNs was an area I remained so passionate about. So when the PSDI project started up, we were tasked with looking into process recording with our original sort of case studies and pilot studies around that first phase of PSDI, I was very, very excited when I was asked to be involved in this. And so naturally, we also started to undertake some sort of further investigations. We ran 2 community surveys, sort of looking at, whether the landscape had actually changed, were any of our predictions or kind of hypotheses correct, and also whether sort of attitudes and uses of ELNs had changed, and also just generally getting a bit of the lay of the land, what new tools existed, what things had happened while we were all sort of hiding at home away from the virus. So this is just a bit of an overview of the kind of state of play across our research from 2022 and 2023. And as I kind of alluded to in my previous slide, some things had changed, but others really hadn't. So there was still a use of paper demonstrated by our sort of first survey, but also we did notice that there was at least a reduction in purely using paper. But there was nonetheless still this obvious need to sort of connect paper and electronic work together. So I don't want to go into this in too much detail because I have we've done entire presentations on this. So if you want to go look at the sort of PSDIs and Odo link, you will see, and also indeed look at our previous reports. We've got sort of long bits of information around this. But the sort of, I guess some of the key findings were, people were still using paper, at least a bit. They were still trying to work out how to connect together paper and electronic work. And I think importantly, a lot of the barriers to usage and all the concerns that people had still aligned very strongly with the barriers that I'd kind of identified back in 2018. If anything, there were maybe more barriers. I discovered more barriers, but they kind of still aligned into the same different sort of areas and categories that I'd sort of mentioned previously. And the ELN market saturation also continued. So there were still over sort of 80 active ELNs. Again, some were new, some earlier ones have kind of gone out of existence, some have been purchased by others, but overall, there was still this kind of overwhelming amount of choice. Again, we did identify that ELNs had actually evolved somewhat. So whereas in 2018, the majority of ELN vendors basically just sold ELNs, and they, this is your replacement to your paper lab notebook. But we were starting to see kind of a bit of an emergence of entire digital platforms where the ELN was just one component. So some of that was also offering kind of a whole suite of different tools alongside or sort of in conjunction with the ELN. So laboratory information management systems and scientific data management systems and inventory management systems. So trying to make things that were more of a sort of cohesive toolkit for researchers, but also kind of highlighting that, you know, I think there were some perceptions that maybe your ELN itself should be kind of all singing or dancing or magical, whilst also seamlessly replacing your paper lab notebook. But really, actually, that kind of notebook component is one part of this kind of wider ecosystem. And, you know, also, I think there'd been this kind of, one of the things I also realized through my PhD was people didn't necessarily even like the term ELN. They got very upset at the idea of people trying to replace their paper lab notebooks. So we'd also kind of noticed, particularly a lot of the academic groups I'm part of, also definitely some of the, again, industry conferences I've been to, that people were almost trying to persuade people to use them by marketing them slightly differently. So kind of giving them a whole different set of names. So things like digital research platform, electronic research notebook, research data management software. So almost trying to get across, you know, this isn't just us taking your paper notebook away for no reason. This is kind of almost the overarching intent of the tool. And actually, interestingly, so we did in our 2022 survey where we actually looked at who was using tools. Unfortunately, 50% of the people still said they weren't using any ELN, but that did suggest the other 50 were using something. 17% were using sort of generic notebooking software, and 33% were using kind of 17 different ELNs. So I think this just also very much shows that, yeah, some more usage had happened, more people were sort of looking at it. There'd been a wider effort around, you know, actually how we market this, how people are actually sold to use these kind of tools, and how people are trying to persuade them to use these kind of tools. But ultimately, still a lot of people weren't using them, and there was no key player. And I mean, I would argue, while certain companies have started to certainly flag up more, the more I talk to different people who are using ELNs, I think the sort of key player in this is still kind of very dependent on a number of different factors. But I mean, that was very interesting to us and definitely showed us that, you know, it felt like there was some progress, but ultimately there was still a lot more work to be done. But over the last 2 years, we've been really lucky because PSDI has been involved in a number of different implementation case studies. So this is ranging from using generic notebooks to sort of custom developed in-house ELNs to large scale industry ELNs, implemented across a few different educational institutes. And these case studies have just been really interesting, like really, really interesting. And I've enjoyed working on them so much because they've demonstrated that while things are still really challenging and really complicated, and these implementations are hard, they are actually possible. And this is really exciting because I have to be honest, at the end of my PhD, I was feeling maybe they weren't possible. I was hard to see how we were going to overcome some of these barriers and how we were actually going to get these tools, particularly into academia. But actually, suddenly these things are starting to happen, and that's really exciting. And each of these implementations has taught some really sort of valuable lessons about how to undertake these challenges. So just to give you a bit of an overview before we dive in, so in these case studies, we've worked with 3 different implementations of OneNote under that kind of generic notebook implementation bit. So we've observed and evaluated the usage of OneNote at the University of Nottingham undergraduate chemistry labs, which have now gone paperless. And we observed Wellington School, who've actually managed to go paperless across all 3 of their science labs, so in chemistry, physics, and biology. And also a bit closer to home in Southampton, we have implemented OneNote in several of our undergraduate chemistry labs, which actually went paperless before COVID with respect to using laptops to capture data in the lab, but then the students actually needed an electronic notebook to write up their experiments. And of course, this was very much, there were obviously other generic notebooking tools, as I mentioned, but OneNote was considered very beneficial because it was already part of the Microsoft ecosystem. Lots of people already knew how to use it. Obviously, it's not free, but it's already being paid for as part of the Microsoft package. So it made a lot of sense to use that as a generic notebooking tool. We've also worked with a custom-built ELN called AI for Green. So this is an open source in-house ELN built by researchers at the University of Nottingham under Professor Jonathan Hurst's group. So this is a really cool ELN as it's geared towards promoting sustainable chemistry practices. And as well as the kind of generic note-taking that you'd expect from an ELN, it also provides information to the user about the environmental impact of the solvents that they're using, and actually will suggest alternatives that would have less environmental impact if they want to use it, which is very cool. And we've also observed the implementation of, sort of both of this student version in their teaching labs, but also their full research version in one of their postgraduate labs. And then again, over at Southampton, we're currently running an electron lab notebook trial with gravity signals across 12 different research groups in our chemistry department. So the next section of this talk is kind of run through these different challenges and explain the key considerations that need to be taken into account. And then I'm also going to kind of go over sort of examples of how these were tackled by each of the different implementations that we've either kind of studied or we've sort of been part of setting up. So the first challenge is choice. So as I alluded to before, there were lots and lots of ELNs on the market when we looked in 2018, when we looked in 2022, and there are still lots and lots of ELNs on the market. So this is a list of every active ELN I can find. But honestly, every time I go to a conference, I hear about a new one. And I'm also aware that lots of institutes also choose to develop their own in-house ELNs. So this is somewhat of a minefield. And also I would say this is a good list, but there are almost certainly going to be other ones out there that I either haven't heard about yet or that companies are very much using in themselves. And in addition to specific ELNs, because there's been a lot of push around things like electronic research notebooks and should we be using more generic tools, there's also a lot of generic notebooking tools that exist, which sort of are often bracketed more under that sort of overarching ERN bracket. And these range from sort of simple text editors to sort of word processors that everyone's quite familiar with, but also, I guess, more complex or more kind of rounded note-taking platforms, so things like OneNote, but also more complicated things like sort of Obsidian or Notion, which kind of have more like project management-y and other bits put in them. Only some of these things are quite cool. I have to say I've tried a bunch of them and haven't actually settled on my favourite yet still, although I do keep circling back to OneNote. But I will say an obvious disadvantage to these is that they don't contain any kind of specific domain-based features, which is what we see a lot of in kind of ELNs. But they're also quite simple and intuitive to use and would potentially work for sort of generic note-taking and note-taking outside of lab-based disciplines, which I kind of wanted to mention because obviously this is more about implementing ELNs, but there's also no reason that depending on the situation you couldn't use something more generic. But also if you were thinking about note-taking tools for non-lab-based disciplines, it's worth knowing that these things exist. So as you probably guessed from the two slides I've just shown you, there is an overwhelming amount of choice. And there's lots of things you need to consider when you're making this choice. So the first thing you really need to think about is what problem are you actually trying to solve? And do you have all of the relevant information to hand to help you make this choice? So I frequently get people asking me just, how do I implement an ELN? But when I ask things like, so what does your current setup look like? What data are you recording? What aren't you recording? So what are these kind of key aims you're trying to achieve? What are the pain points you're trying to address? They often don't have those answers. And I think you really need to have a solid overview of, what the problem is, what you're trying to do, and understand, I guess, almost what's your business as usual processes that you really want to overturn here. Because that's really, really important, because otherwise you're just kind of blowing into the wind and going, oh, I want to implement a system, but I'm not quite sure why, and I'm not quite sure, what it's going to do. And it's really important to note that one size doesn't fit all. And one of the reasons there are so many ELNs out there is that there are lots and lots of different domains and there are lots of different types of institutions. And these all have very different requirements and different data types. And some ELNs, if we sort of hark back to that 2018 sort of graph slide, some are a lot more aligned with specific disciplines. And then if we think about kind of adding a further layer of complication to this, universities or large-scale research companies will need to cater for a variety of domains. So finding one that could cover your entire institution is actually very challenging. And I'd be delighted to be proved wrong if someone has implemented an ELN that works across every single discipline in the university. I would love to hear about it, always happy to hear about these things. But I guess I just think that the breadth of requirements across different domains, or even if you just think about one domain, so even if we just think about chemistry, which in itself has so many different subdomains with different requirements, finding the one that can actually cater to everything is going to be quite challenging and potentially quite unlikely, depending on the scale and kind of domain breadth of your institution. I think we also just need to think about different career level requirements, so particularly within academia. So digital tools for undergrads need to facilitate learning, and they are much more about teaching them to produce good scientific record keeping. Whereas postgraduate researchers need to be supported to produce fair data and fair research, which doesn't mean you can't use the same system, but they may require different setup, different versions. It's also worth noting that there's kind of slightly different requirements. So, researchers want to be able to, may want to, depending on the privacy of their project, they may want to be able to super lock down their project so only their supervisors can see it, or they may want to share it more widely with additional collaborators, potentially inside or outside their institution. But also undergrads, let's face it, realistically should be less concerned about privacy because you're not necessarily developing research that could be scooped by somebody else. But they'd need to be shared directly with lecturers. They might need to be shared with fellow students for group projects. But again, these are just slightly different nuances around what we need, which just kind of comes back to understanding, what problem are we trying to solve. So the learnings from our kind of original, from some of our case studies. So we have generic notebooking tool, which we've implemented, and this has sort of a selection of simple notebooking templates and such like, and we've chosen a tool that's already implemented in the current ecosystem. So this is an example of using OneNote both across kind of undergrad laboratories and Nottingham and Southampton. So that's picking something that people already know how to use, already works for them, and doesn't actually require anything really, really complicated. We've also got the AI for Green, which is an in-house custom ELN made for the University of Nottingham, and that was actually created in 2 different versions. So there was a pedagogical version for teaching, and there was also a research version for researchers. So that, again, kind of demonstrating actually that there are 2. You can have the same system ultimately at the core, but you may want to have sort of different things for different levels. And then for Revity Signals, which we've implemented at Southampton, so we actually selected a large-scale ELN tool that could meet the different needs of sort of some of the different subdomains of chemistry we're actually supporting. But ultimately, we've also chosen a tool that's compatible with a department software ChemDraw that everybody's really, really, people are very attached to it. They really don't want to stop using it. They're less keen on systems that don't integrate with it. So I guess ultimately what we're trying to say here is there isn't necessarily a right answer. Our studies have looked at different ELN implementations, but ultimately all in kind of science areas. But we've implemented them in different ways depending on the needs. So I would argue it's a lot more about how you implement it than what you pick in the first place. So you may be thinking that once you've made a choice, you've kind of job done, but I'm afraid that that's not really the case. So that's kind of merely the tip of the iceberg, because as I've sort of demonstrated by my previous slide, there are lots and lots of options to choose from. And yes, you can implement different options successfully, but you need to think about all of these different institutional and infrastructural considerations in order to make this work. So I guess I want to be really clear that implementing ELNs is so much more than just picking one and buying their licenses. So you need to establish a solid infrastructure, and you really need to understand and consider the different stakeholders with respect to the ELN, and also define the different roles that need to be filled. So I'm sure this is kind of a familiar slide to anyone who's kind of done more of this, business analysis type of stuff, but you need to sort of think about your primary stakeholders. So who's actually going to be using the ELN directly? The secondary ones, they won't necessarily use it day to day, but they will be needed to support it, and they may need to influence people to use it. And then, of course, the tertiary stakeholders who will provide this sort of supporting infrastructure to enable the ELN to be set up and to continue running it. And unfortunately, this doesn't happen by magic, and this requires time and people. So it's really important that you also identify the different roles that are needed to ensure you have the relevant people to actually do the work. So apologies for the wall of text. Don't worry, these slides will be shared on Zenodo later, but this is just to give a kind of example of the stakeholders we identified for our Southampton case study. So this is our kind of formal identification, sort of our midpoint of the trial, so looking at what's been done and what needs to happen moving forward. So our primary stakeholders are like our day-to-day users of the researchers and the students who actually use it in their work, group leaders who use it to review their researchers' work, and sort of teaching staff who can review their students' work, and also again on both of those parts sort of do their own research. We've got the secondary stakeholders, so head of chemistry is very important because he controls our budget and gets the overall say about whether the ELN will continue to be implemented and got implemented in the first place. and also our health and safety staff, because they need to ensure that everyone using the ELN complies with health and safety requirements. So it's not just about putting experiments into our ELN, it's about obviously doing your health and safety due diligence planning before you've done your experiments, and then they also obviously need to be able to access things to see what's going on. We've also got our ELN administrators in the tertiary side of things. So to start with, that was myself and my colleague Matthew Partridge from PSDI. So we oversaw this kind of original ELN development, like sorting out templates and training and supporting the users, which is really, really important. And we also identified the IT support staff because they need to support like the smooth running of the service and provide technical support, such as thinking in with single sign-on and ensuring secure backups of notebook entries. And then we also identified kind of administrative staff to administer user accounts, make sure students and staff are added to sort of relevant places when they come in, and also really importantly, ensure smooth transition of account data if people leave. And this is kind of similar to the previous slide, but just to kind of flesh out more of the sort of different roles and work for those different stakeholders that we've identified. Because it's not just about understanding the different stakes people have in, I guess, but it's also, what is the different level of work required from the different parties? So not just who will need to interact with the ELN, but who actually needs to do the work, because otherwise you can't have the implementation work without kind of putting this work into practice. So another really important thing to consider hand in hand with staffing requirements is time. So I guess please listen to me when I say, this cannot happen overnight. It requires planning. So sometimes you might need quite a bit of time just to persuade people that you need to do it in the first place. And of course, these things cost money. So you can't just arbitrarily go out and bring it in if you're doing something that does cost money. And even, and as I will explain when I get to the cost part, even if you were bringing in something free, there are still going to be other costs associated. So you kind of do need to make sure that business case that actually it's going to be worth the cost. I'll talk about this a bit more when I go on to my hardware section next, but there's also thinking about having your labs actually set up for ELN usage. Again, there's sort of identifying the staffing, but we just kind of talked about the, who is actually going to fill those roles. It's one thing having the stakeholders, but when we talk about those different roles and the what needs to happen, who is going to do that? Now we've identified it. You may wish to run a trial. Again, this kind of depends. So for Southampton, we have chosen to run a trial with 50 people that we're running for about a year. And, we're in the process of making decisions about whether we'll continue that and whether that goes sort of department-wide, whereas for the other trials, doing OneNote with our undergraduate labs, that was sort of put into, 2 specific labs for AI for Green. That took time, more time in terms of actually they had to develop the software. So developing was also need to be factored in. So there's kind of, again, a range of different things that need to be thought of before you're actually ready to almost press go and get people to use it. You also need to have templates in place. You need to have everything set up. The people that are going to be training you to use the software need to be able to impart to others how to use the software. You may have lots of logistics you need to organize. So yeah, I guess this key thing is it's always going to take longer than you think it's going to take. And you can't just say, oh, we've bought it now and everyone go and use it. So if you are going to do this successfully, I do really implore you to think about all these different steps and have a sort of realistic time frame for when you're actually going to launch a system. And then of course, so hardware is a really kind of big barrier. So I mentioned this, back at the PhD stage when I was investigating it, and lots of people didn't want to take their computer into the labs. So you need to be sort of thinking about, what electronic devices actually are going to be used, who's going to supply those devices, because ultimately, I think dedicated lab hardware is key to this, or at least having that sort of option. But then again, who is going to supply that? Do there need to be extra devices? This obviously then is going to link into the cost that I'm about to talk about. Interoperability is also kind of really important to think about in terms of devices and actually being able to support the software you want to use. Also, the environmental setup is also quite important because labs aren't just hostile to computers in terms of, oh, I might spill a chemical over it, but it's also things like, does your lab have good Wi-Fi? Or do you have the capacity to kind of plug in desktop computers with a LAN connection? Or do you need to use things offline? Like, I've obviously talked about ELNs, I've been thinking about labs, but these could be used for other disciplines such as, I don't know, archaeology or other things where you're still kind of doing investigative field work, but again, you might need to use that offline. So, you know, if you are thinking about notebooking tools outside of the kind of more scientific lab discipline, then it is worth thinking about that. But also there may be the odd lab that doesn't have connectivity. So again, does that need to be used offline? Will there be kind of risk of contamination? And if so, how are you going to mitigate against that? So that's why I kind of say I think dedicated lab hardware is often quite important for that, because then you're basically just not worrying about taking computers in and out of the lab. And I think really a key thing is you've probably got to make a decision there. You could do paper in the lab and computers outside, or you could do dedicated computer in the lab and another computer outside. But I think the worst case scenario is you wandering your computer between the lab and your office, and realistically that's just not safe. So that then this kind of leads nicely into the slide on costs. So as I said before, this is a lot more complicated than just buying licenses, but also it's more costly than just buying licenses. So, you know, not all ELNs cost money, but a lot of the big scale ones do. So of course there could be licenses for that. I mean, I guess if you're using something generic like OneNote, it's not like it's free, but you're probably already paying for it as part of your Microsoft ecosystem. Whereas obviously other things like ELNs, or you would have, if they were costly, you would have to then pay to bring in those licenses. But then again, if your labs aren't suitable for this work, then you may actually need to do some renovation. You may need to install more power sockets or Ethernet sockets or Wi-Fi boosters. You'll be charging more devices. So, I mean, that's not necessarily a bad thing, because you'll be kind of maybe offsetting that with the fact that you won't be wasting tons and tons of paper notebooks. But again, it is kind of worth thinking about the fact that actually you may, if you end up having that sort of duplicate hardware setup, there's a lot more devices that need to be powered up. You may need to replace legacy equipment in the lab if things need to be interoperable, general maintenance and development costs, and also, of course, staffing costs. So actually paying for the time of the people to do that work. So, I mean, again, this is really interesting, and I feel like I learned a lot from the different case studies for this. So looking at OneNote implementation in the school, they actually implemented a policy where students starting in the first year needed to bring in a Microsoft Surface. So I will caveat, this was quite a fancy private school, so they could get away with that. But, you know, existing students were given a choice. So you could then start using it if you wanted to, but ultimately that sort of first year it was mandated, and therefore they were able to go paperless across all their science labs over the course of several years. But again, this also kind of fits into, you know, that took time. They were able to actually ask people to supply their devices. And again, you could do that in industry. I don't really think you could get away with that in academia potentially. I don't think you could get away with making them supply their own devices. Industry, you could just supply, I would expect the industry would just supply the devices. Again, it can get a bit complicated. You kind of need to have a plan. But also they refurbed their lab so that they had lots of power sockets around, and they had actual space for devices. And then similarly, putting OneNote and AI for Green into the university labs at Nottingham. Again, for the undergrads, they actually purchased Microsoft Surfaces, but this was also part of a lab refurb. So they were able to kind of build into the lab setup what they actually wanted. So there were spaces for tablets, spaces for hardware, spaces for charging. Again, for our university labs at Southampton, for undergrads, we actually had a lab safe put in with loads and loads of laptops. But again, this was done as part of a lab refurb. For the postgrad labs for AI for Green at Nottingham, they kind of had desktops. They had little desktops that locked away with LAN connections because the Wi-Fi wasn't great, and they had nicely raised screens sort of above the lab benches, one per fume hood, so everybody had access to one, and then you just had sort of keyboards and mice on the desk. So again, you weren't completely immune to there being any issues. I did see one somewhat acid mangled keyboard, but by and large, it was the least expensive, least risky equipment that was sort of out potentially, and most people were careful, and the sort of important stuff was kind of at least kept at a bit of a distance. And similarly for Revity signals, we actually asked as part of our sort of pre-trial preparation, because I mean, for the other case studies, we kind of came in, for some of the other case studies outside Southampton, we kind of came in when they were sort of in progress in terms of things were set up. So we were more able to observe what they had done. For Southampton, taking that on board. For the postgrads, because the undergrads already had laptops, we asked group leaders and students, do you actually need hardware? Because some already had some extra lab hardware, some didn't want lab hardware because they wanted to use their paper lab notebooks and then move out to a computer on the in their office areas because of Wi-Fi issues or other reasons, as they were quite happy to duplicate that because I thought it helped them be thorough. whereas other people specifically asked for hardware, which we then provided. So I think learning the actual sort of how important the hardware setup, the technical setup, and really reducing that kind of cross-contamination was incredibly important. So as much as, you know, we of course we need to think about the people and we really need to think about the software, actually providing that kind of environment for people to use the ELNs well is really, really important. There's also lots of different data considerations to be put into place. So the first one is kind of thinking about backup and storage and security. So there's kind of a lot of mistrust with digital tools. So some people are really worried about putting their data into ELNs. Some people are worried about security and potentially having things scooped or stolen out of the software. Now, I mean, of course, it's not an unreasonable concern, although I do think we probably need a bit of education around how likely that could be. But equally, the British Library was subject to a horrible attack like that. So again, we kind of do need to be mindful of that. And I guess then it's just also just a case of thinking, well, where's that data going to be stored? Do you need to either set up your own thing, or do you need to do a deal with the institution you're working with to say, actually, all the data needs to be stored, you know, on site in line with our security protocols? And then there's also a lot of concerns about sort of data exit strategy. So it's not just about, will someone steal my data, but it's also about, if I put my data in, can I get it back out again? So you should always have a data exit strategy in place, because that's really, really important. And also just thinking about then from that, how, you know, what format could you get your data back out in? Then sort of some case study learnings around this was, I mean, obviously, if you're using something like OneNote or a generic system that's already linked in, you know, we don't have to worry about that too much because that's already sort of part of the formal university backups. The AI for Green, you know, that was a custom built Nottingham University ELN. So shockingly, the Nottingham students and staff weren't that concerned that the Nottingham people might run off with their data, or also that they just kind of pull it and then they wouldn't be able to get it back out again. But obviously they did sort of do their backup due diligence. And then for Brevity Signals, they've got an API, and we actually created our own backup system for the trial where we pull closed experiments every single day, and we store them as a backup so that people can get to them if there's a problem, but also so because particularly as it's a trial, we do have like a formal data exit strategy. There's also thinking about templates and data capture. So again, kind of we talked about those different domain needs. So different domains will require different levels of data capture, different type of data capture. There'll be different formats need to be supported by the ELN, and sort of thinking about the different types of things that we're going to be doing. So you don't want to have tons and tons of templates, but it is ideal to have some templates to kind of cover the range of different work that's going to go on, but also then to kind of encourage people to actually put their data in a structured format. Because then if we move on to this next point, you know, as we said at the beginning, a key reason to implement sort of any digital notebook tool or any ELN is to produce fairer data for your publication. So you've got to think about this in your implementation plan. And again, we've got to think about this from the beginning. So not just, oh, if it's all in the ELN, I guess it will be fair because we can share it nicely at the end. It's more, well, actually, how are we getting people to put data in the first place to encourage them to not just put data in, but all their kind of observations and all the information about the experiments that will actually then exist in the system for kind of permeating through and future use. And also, again, it's really important that actually this facilitates the relevant sort of sharing between the different people that you need to be able to share between. So again, we kind of learned a lot from these different case studies from this. So for our generic sort of notebooking, we had simple templates created to match like lab and classroom work. So I mean, both across kind of the school, Southampton, Nottingham, all those kind of use of OneNote in those different places. Nice little templates were created, and the notebooks were sort of shared in that sort of classroom style of OneNote so that different teachers and classes could see the relevant things. AI for Green actually had they listened to a lot of what their students wanted. Keris and myself were alongside the Nottingham team were involved in quite a few focus groups and sort of interviews and surveys to sort of understand what people needed, and they quite liked having sort of structured sections for their notes and for their write-up because they really wanted kind of guidance towards what they should be writing, which again is something we should actually be thinking about in terms of teaching our students note-taking. And again, things were sort of relevantly shared so people could collaborate across different groups on their labs. And then for Brevity Signals, we actually went and created some custom templates. We surveyed people before they got involved, what sort of data do you record, what sort of science are you doing, and we actually ended up making kind of 3 different templates for that. We had one for synthesis, we had one for sort of general computational notes, and then we had one for sort of a general scientific template as well. So this was sort of really useful, I think, to actually kind of get people to start putting things in the correct way. And then we sort of get on to people. So people are arguably one of the biggest problems, but I always think kind of actually that's a nice thing in a way, because then people could also be one of the biggest solutions. So actually, top-down influence is really important. Of course, you need the people to be willing and be on board, but if you don't have the people at the top on board, then that can be a real problem, because they need to support it, and also ultimately probably need to sign off on things like budgets and paying for it, and enabling all the things I've kind of laid out. But of course, you need to get the whole group on board, or in some cases, actually bringing in those kind of early adopters is actually really useful. So we identified in Southampton 50 people that were happy to get involved, rather than trying to make everybody in the department involved, so that then we can actually show those benefits, because it is really hard to get people to agree to do what they perceive as extra work, unless you kind of have demonstrated this kind of benefit. So again, kind of thinking about the case study learnings, identifying those stakeholders, identifying the roles, understanding how people need to be involved, engaging in the relevant groups, and also across those different hierarchies to sort of really understand the landscape, and also just, I guess, build this vision of success, so get people to understand the benefits of what you're trying to achieve. So this has been a kind of long rambling journey, but these are kind of, I guess, all of the different things I think are really important to take into account, because otherwise, it can be really complicated to implement these systems. But if you kind of work through these processes and you think about all these different areas, then I think you've got a much better chance of achieving this. And PSDI is here to help. So we have a whole range of different things available. We launched our V1 a couple of months ago, and we have lots and lots of useful resources and services that can help you. And not just with ELNs, but I am going to focus on kind of the process recording, ELNs, digital note-taking areas. So firstly, we've got the knowledge base. So it was actually created by the lovely Karis who was on this call, but this provides guidance for all the physical scientists, and around a lot of different topics related to research data and our PSDI technology and resources, but more specifically for sort of ELNs. We've got guidance around ELN implementation. We've got sort of training things around fair data and research data management. There are example templates put up for physical sciences. So there's lots of different useful resources that, again, can kind of complement the things we've been saying. And there will also be case studies working their way onto the knowledge base that kind of look at some of these different implementations in detail, so you can kind of go through and see sort of step by step what's been done. There's also, I want to note ELN Finder. So ELN Finder is a really cool piece of software. So a while ago, I thought it would be really nice if there was something that enabled people to choose between different ELNs, and sort of understand what all the different ELN factors are. And then I went to a conference and found out someone else was indeed doing that. So I thought actually what would be really great is if we could just contribute to that. And it was actually quite cool looking, because they've got over 40 different filter criteria for you to sort of choose between different ELNs. And actually, if I map that to a lot of the things that people said they really cared about that we looked at in our surveys around ELNs, almost all of them overlap. So it feels like both of us must have been doing something right. There's over 40 ELNs in here now, and we are constantly working to try and make sure that more and more get added, because it would be lovely to have a really wide representation of the ELNs in here. But this does give you a really good starting point. And also, if you then look at some of those different filters, you can kind of think about some of those different features that you need to be considering. I also wanted to give a note to the Data Revival service. So Data Revival is a really cool service created by our friend Sam Monday, which has been spun out as a company through the university, but he has given PSDI a free version. So this can be used to scan your handwritten lab book pages and basically turn them into machine readable data and kind of pull out the chemistry. And yeah, there's a free version of this you can play with on our website, because I guess the reason this is so important is, even if you implement a digital notebook now, you still need to consider what's going to happen to all of your legacy data. Yeah, you could start doing things right today, but what about yesterday? So we do need to think about how we can actually almost retrospectively deal with some of maybe our past note-taking errors. I also want to note the research notebook community. So PSDI is working with, I believe I also saw on the school, Valerie McCutcheon, to sort of re-establish the research notebook community. So I will say this isn't just about ELNs, and this isn't just about electronic notebooks. This is about kind of anyone and everyone interested in research notebooks. And we're also working to revamp sort of that website, because there's a lot of really good, so this is research notebooks, there's a lot of really good case studies on there that we're working to sort of organize, which again, that you can see how other people have gone and implemented different ELNs, and we'll also be putting on a range of events over the next few years. But please do come and join our mailing list, and there's also a separate group, get involved if you're interested, for sort of champions around this. You can drop us a line, but again, we're really trying to establish a core community around people interested in research notebooks. So I guess to conclude, this is kind of, as I said, this is hard, but it is possible. But all of these considerations do need to be taken into account, and you do need to ask the right questions. And you need to identify, how you're going to kind of measure progress, how you're going to measure your success, what you're actually trying to achieve in the first place, and kind of, again, thinking through all those different steps. And this requires dedicated time and people to make it happen. But ultimately, PSDI, we are here to help. And for those of you wondering what my title was about, it was about Agatha all along. And the clues were all of the different witches included in this presentation are actually featured in the credits of our show. So I don't want to spoil it for you, but suffice to say, the Witch's Road that I based my title off features many challenges that need to be overcome. And I just felt that was a really good way to describe this ELN journey. And just to say a huge thank you to everyone who's been involved in this research over the years. So thank you for listening to my story, and I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you, Samantha. That was such an engaging talk. I really appreciate how you shared the reality of ELN implementation, not just the successes, but also the tricky bits and the lessons learned. We'll now open the floor for questions. Data curation takes time. Do we think principal researchers are allowing time for it? Example from research software, we always want super science produced with code, but often not appreciate the time it takes to produce proper, fair software.
Do I think researchers are allowing time for data curation? Unfortunately, I think they'd like to, but I don't think they are, because I don't think they have time. I mean, this, I guess, brings me to one of my other key passions is, I don't think we should be expecting researchers to do all of this data curation themselves. I think this is why we really need data stewards. So, and also I think, again, we need people to help facilitate actually capturing and getting this data in effectively from the beginning. So I think obviously, we've certainly at these different trials, particularly the Southampton one, because obviously I've been involved hands-on in the sort of creation of this, we've put a lot of time and effort into us thinking about data capture and what do we expect people to capture, and tailoring those templates to try and get that. So we haven't expected the scientists to do that. We've put that into place, and we've trained people on sort of, this is how to use the system and this is what we expect you to put in, and then they kind of have that platform to do it. But obviously doing their work in the lab is only kind of one component, whereas then if we think about some of the kind of wider, then again, fair sharing aspects of this, yes, you've got your if we take science, your ELN records, your experiment records, great. And actually, hopefully, what we've done around the ELN will help you produce things that are better than what was being done before. But then if we then talk about, actually, say you're doing your research paper, you're going to actually then publish this data, you're going to create the metadata, you're going to do the licensing, you're going to do all those other bits. Or maybe your research isn't just experiments in the lab, maybe it's also, I don't know, some computational things, or maybe it's some human-based stuff with, I don't know, taking in, needing ethics applications, doing surveys, doing focus groups, etc. There are so many different facets for this, and this is where I think we need help. So then we need sort of data stewards coming around that. So I think there's a lot of different, I guess, research technical professional enabling roles that actually we need across different research projects to enable us to actually produce proper, fair data and fair software.
What does Wellington do in other parts of the school? Do they mandate it in science for note taking, but not in other parts of the school?
That is a very good question, but I honestly don't know the answer. I got very excited about the fact that their science labs were paperless. And I have to confess, we didn't talk about their other disciplines, but it is something I could absolutely find out. Final question. case study of a lab before and after implementation, this could show the benefits. Yes, I mean, I guess Southampton's kind of a good example of that, in the sense that we know what we looked like before, and we've got kind of an overview of what we had before, and then we're currently in the process of looking at how things have developed and changed through people using the ELN. So we've had our midterm survey, and then we'll be doing another survey at the end of the year, and then we will be able to demonstrate sort of the change and the switch to electromagnetic systems. That will feature in our case study. But also, I would love to do more of those. So, always looking to get involved in different areas.
Thank you, Samantha. And let me just conclude the meeting. Just to reiterate, our PSDI resources are live now. As Samantha mentioned in her talk, we have a number of PSDI resources available to help with the process recording and FAIR data. But it's not just about ELNs, but PSDI provides a range of online services to help you find, process, and learn about working with research data, including both core services and resources aimed at specific scientific communities. So if you are curious, I would encourage you to check our website. There is a lot of this which could help you in your own research and data management journey. Before concluding, these are our upcoming events. Our next webinar in the series will be with Dr. Matthew Patridge. On the 16th of October, he will be sharing insights from his work on the data auditing process using in the physical chemistry properties data collection. These are our socials. You can sign up and you can register in our JISC emailing list for the upcoming events. Thank you once again for attending today's event, and thank you for Dr. Samantha for her excellent presentation. Wishing you all a great rest of day, and we hope to see you at another PSD event. Thank you again.